it was a good sign to see like merchandise come out of it because that's when you know the show's doing well. Because like sadly, like a lot of other shows didn't get that kind of like recognition on Cartoon Network. It was hard to like find a lot of like merchandise in certain places. And it just depended on like if the show was getting promoted or not. And sadly, Cartoon Network like was very like choosy with like how they like picked and like choose like chose like which shows to promote more. But yeah, regular show and Adventure Time, like we definitely we got a lot of really good promotional stuff out of it, so that was good. Like billboards, it was really cool to see like billboards of the characters and everything. That's when I knew like, okay, we're on the right track. We got a billboard finally.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Regular Show Wiki's 15th anniversary interviews. Today's guest is Regular Show's longest running storyboard artist, boarding over 60 episodes across all 8 seasons. Please welcome Benton Connor.
Hello there, how you doing?
We'll start from the very beginning. When did you first get interested in animation and know that this was the kind of career that you wanted to pursue?
As far as animation goes,
It's I could probably like trace it back to like as long as I can remember, as far back as like my youth, like basically ever since I could pick up a marker. Like I've always been like drawn to like cartoons and just animation, like all things animated. Like, I was glued to everything that was on like early Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon back in like the 90s, which is when I grew up. And it was just like I remember like stopping like when I was a kid, I would like pause like an episode of a show or something, and like I would literally go through it frame by frame, stepping through it. I would even ask my parents, like, could you pause it? Could you pause it? Back in the days when, VCRs were the thing way before DVD players even existed. And I would record like a show or something, and that way I could go back and like go through it step by step, frame by frame, and stop it on a frame where there was like a funny pose and like draw from that. And that's I was probably like 5 or 6. That's like some of my earliest memories of like being like kind of like attuned to animation or anything kind of like having like a very specific interest in it. And like I just really like, and I learned as I got older, I got, obviously, the more shows I watched, the more interested I became in like how things were made and the process behind animation and everything. And I just really like immersed, not just like TV stuff, but also like feature film, stuff, other other animated shows from other countries, some Japanese animation here and there. But yeah, I was definitely heavily influenced more so by like the early 90s style like of Nickelodeon, like Ren and Stimpy, Rocko's Modern Life, all those shows from back in the day. Beavis and Butthead, that was a big one. But yeah, as I got older, I, drew more and more. I took art classes. I did my own projects on the side. I tried to like actually learn how 2D animation worked. And then I found out when I was a little older, by the time I got to high school, I found out about a really very renowned school that was, famous for animation. It was Cal Arts or California Institute of the Arts in Valencia, California. And I found out about it through like a family friend. Like I knew someone who like studied acting there, and I looked into like, the history of the school and found out about like all the other the whole host of animators over the years, throughout several, last 40 years at least, of all like the different like animators who have come and gone throughout the generations. And I found out about like, some Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon people who like went to Cal Arts, like, Stephen Hillenburg, who created SpongeBob, and Craig McCracken, who created, Powerpuff Girls, and found out like they started out like doing their own student shorts as well. And I really that was also the time like film festivals were kind of a thing back in the day, like underground like animation festivals, kind of like Spike and Mike was a big one. And I remember like seeing a lot of like shorts like coming out from that particular festival, and like that was like a sensibility of animation that I was particularly drawn to, where it was like kind of edgy and little underground kind of. Like still had like some I still like to like have like, cartoons that have some charm, but also like there's like a bit of an edge to some of those shorts, which I kind of liked. So that was something I got into creatively. But yeah, I found out about like Cal Arts, and I got a portfolio together when I was my senior year of high school. And, I applied to a bunch of different art schools, and I had heard like how insanely hard it was to get into Cal Arts. And I I really, to this day, honestly, I'm amazed. I'm still amazed. Like I even like, got selected because it was I got in my first try actually, which is I can't even believe to this day I'm even saying like I'm so amazed like because there's a lot of stories I heard of people, who had tried many, many times and I was very fortunate, because I had a very specific interest in animation, but I also like had really good like traditional like education as far as like how to approach art and how to approach like life drawing and everything. So I will say that's a big like bonus if you can like have that in your portfolio when you're like applying for art school. And even if it's animation, having a good thorough understanding of like, seeing the world and having, an understanding of like anatomy and how to draw from life. It's like really crucial. But yeah, I again to this day I'm just so grateful I was able to get into Cal Arts and yeah, I really am fortunate because of the time that I went, it was an interesting time because around that time, I mean everybody who it was interesting because when you are going to school, like I went to school that, it wasn't like an art school per se for my high school. Like it was just like I grew up with like kind of like regular education, like boarding schools per se. My parents were teachers and they didn't really know anything about art. So it was like kind of like very unusual for me, like to be like the only artist for a lot of people. But it was interesting and exciting for me to finally go to a place like Cal Arts because I got to meet people who were artists and had the same, similar interests as I did in animation and maybe, learning something new from different people. So I'm really grateful for that, being able to like step outside my comfort zone, like, learn from other people around me. And like, it was definitely a big learning curve for sure, but it was very, beneficial in my education as far as like in like developing my senses of animation ever since I was a little kid. So yeah. It's crazy though, because I had teachers who had also gone there like from back in the day when the first school first started and back in the 70s and 80s it was like completely different like as far as like tuition it was like way cheaper back then. So yeah, it's definitely been a sign of the times over the years. But like I said, I was really fortunate about the timing that I went because they everybody who didn't really know about animation, like in my family or friends circle from like where I grew up. I grew up on the East Coast in United States. I grew up in New Hampshire, very small, like provincial town that was not a lot of animation related stuff to be had in like New England, unless you go to like New York or somewhere. But for a while, my family thought I'd be going to school in New York, but I ended up going to school in California because that's like where all the animation related jobs were mostly based. And at that time, that was when studios, like major studios like Disney Feature, like they had just made the shift from doing hand drawn to CG. So at the time, like I thought initially I would be doing like CG animation more so than hand drawn. But I really wanted to learn like hand drawn while I was at school and understand like different sides of the production process. And that's when I got really into storyboarding specifically, actually. When I went to Cal Arts, I really decided, like I think like a lot of other people, like, wanted to kind of shift their focus, whether it was individual development or character design or, actual animating. Like I was very drawn, like many people in my class were big on storyboarding, like just telling stories visually and pitching them to a group of people. And like I really found a love for that when I was at school. And then it wasn't until I actually when I got my first animation related job ever, my official animation job ever was at Cartoon Network on a show called The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack. That was my first dip into the animation industry for Cartoon Network specifically, and that was when I found out like a lot of the shows like that at the time because I was about halfway through college when shows because I grew up with like traditional Cartoon Network, old school Cartoon Network when I was really young. Like when I was like in grade school, that was when Dexter's Lab and Johnny Bravo, like all those shows came out. Powerpuff Girls, like those are all like the ones I remember. And it was right around like when Samurai Jack, maybe around that time, like that's when I started to kind of like fizzle out and kind of shift into more like Adult Swim type stuff, like I'd watch like what was on a little later, like like Aqua Teen or Squidbillies or stuff like that. So I kind of like felt like I wanted to do more adult stuff, but then it was right around the time when like Flapjack and Chowder shows like that were coming out, and like they had like a very like slightly adult undertone, but they were still like, universally watched and kids could watch them. So around that time, Flapjack in particular really kind of piqued my creative interest. Like I really wanted to see more shows like that were like geared to kids, but also could be watched by adults kind of, So yeah, it was that around that time, Flapjack had just come out, and I had some friends who were interning and had started doing work while they were in school when I was about a junior, senior around that time. And they were looking for people for board artists on the second, they were like halfway through their second season of Flapjack, and they needed a board artist. So they liked one of my films, and Thurop Van Orman, the creator, through one of my friends, had reached out to me and asked if I wanted to take a test. So I took a storyboard test, and they liked it a lot. So I thankfully I got the gig. Like it was a little bit of a chaotic time because I was in my last semester of my senior year at CalArts, so I was like right on the cusp of graduation. But I mean, thankfully I had job security, like nice little job security cushion into the real world. Also, it was around that time. It was 2008, 2009, so it was like right when the recession had just happened. So like well, the job security issue was a big deal, big issue for me at the time, right as I was about to graduate. So when I got work at Cartoon Network, I felt like that scene in Indiana Jones where he's like going underneath the doorway and the door's about to close and he has to grab his hat. And like just grabbing that hat was like me grabbing a job. So I was like, thank God. So I was thankful for the timing of when I got the job, but also just like the timing of like when I went to school and when I got to graduate, because that was around the time when Flapjack was in its like, kind of like in its like kind of ending phase, sort of. That was right around the time, essentially, when regular show and Adventure Time were just getting started, pretty much, like right as I was graduating. So it was great timing in that regard. And that was like a bit of like a creative renaissance in itself for Cartoon Network, essentially, having shows like regular show and Adventure Time. So yeah, I was very fortunate in that regard again. So yeah.
And so, how did that come along then, getting to work on regular show?
So how it started. So I was working on Flapjack. That again, that was the first show I was working on when I started at Cartoon Network, and that was in 2009, as I was graduating. And my first writing partner at the time was a guy named Mike Roth, who had worked with JG before. Like they had worked with each other before on a couple other shows, like Camp Lazlo, for instance. And JG was at the time when I was on Flapjack, JG was still the creative director of that show, and he had just gotten his pilot done for a regular show. Essentially, when I started working on Flapjack, they had just done that they had done a shorts program at that time called the Cartoon Institute, and it was they had done like all kinds of like different like shorts programs over the years, and that was one that was at that time it was headed up by Craig McCracken from Powerpuff Girls. So it, quite a few like pretty memorable shorts came out of that crop that year. Uncle Grandpa, they did the pilot for that series for Uncle Grandpa, and they did a couple other ones. And regular show, JT had just done the pilot for regular show that year when I started on Flapjack, and I was completely inspired by it. Like they got the whole studio to go up on the roof of the studio, I remember, and they screened it for the entire like studio and everything, and they screened all the shorts. And regular show was a big hit, and that was like everybody's secret favorite. So I knew actually JG from CalArts. He was a senior right around the time when I had just started. I was a freshman, so by the time I was like about to graduate, yeah, he was getting regular show going and finishing on Flapjack. And my writing partner at the time, Mike Roth, was helping JG develop regular show, and Mike ended up becoming like the supervising director on the beginning of regular show essentially. And so I got on to regular show through Mike and JG actually. They knew my work from Flapjack, and they had worked with me pretty closely, and they liked my style, they liked my sensibility, and I was very fortunate. I didn't have to take a test, thankfully, since they knew my work. And I took a test for Flapjack. Some, depending on like what show it is that you're trying to, apply for. I mean, if it's great if you know like people that you've worked with, that's obviously a big bonus. But generally I've had to test for some shows. And in this case, thankfully, they had worked pretty closely with me. So they knew my work and they had me on. So they got me on to try. Dawn was the first one I had done actually. Around that time, I had just finished on Flapjack, but I did do some episodes. I did 2 episodes of Adventure Time briefly before I committed to regular show full time. So when I started on regular show, it was still pretty early on. Like they were just kind of like late into season one. They were kind of like, early season one's always kind of like you're finding like the voice of the show, you're getting things figured out still. So they're still like kind of figuring out a few of the episodes. And Dawn was one in particular that JG had done writing for himself actually. And he got me on kind of like halfway while he was working on it. Him and another person, Kat Morris, was also working on the episode. She had done a few episodes already, so she was pretty familiar with the show. But that was like my first introduction, and it was a good way to get the character, get a good understanding of the characters, like Rigby's character in particular, because it was a very Rigby heavy episode, and it was very relatable for me because I have a younger, not I have an older, I don't have an older brother, but I do have a younger sister, so there's a lot of sibling rivalry aspects of Dawn that I really related to. So it was definitely, I thought coming on to regular show would be similar to like how I worked on Flapjack. In some cases it was, but stylistically and tonally, like as far as the show's humor, it was quite different actually compared to Flapjack. Flapjack was a lot more cartoony. Regular show had a lot more like nuance and kind of like more character driven acting. And, Dawn was like a good example of that because like it was like essentially like these cartoony characters having to talk about like more adult heavy like themes like getting audited by the IRS and like having to do taxes and everything. So and then you get like Dawn who's like this like essentially kind of like a slightly furry-esque character. Kind of like very anatomical, uncomfortable, but like it was interesting trying to like tap into like the very raw character of like the two of them, the sibling rivalry between him and Rigby, and it was interesting. It was cool. It was a cool introduction to regular show because I, was reading a lot of the other episodes and the outlines that they were writing at the time for season one. It was very far out. It was unlike any show that I would imagine having to work on. Like I read like some of the earlier outlines they were writing, like the show, like the episode Excellent in particular. That was an episode that went through like a ton of iterations. And like at one point in the beginning, like there was like a version where like they wrote it so like Rigby does like the omelet eating competition and he eats so much that he like barfs and like the throw up turns into like a vomit man and like he has to like train Rigby to like go back and like try and like win the excellent hat. It was crazy. There were so many episodes that were like kind of evolving as they were like as we're kind of figuring the show out essentially, and it was cool. By the time we got to like we had season one done and that had like finally aired, it was like really kind of interesting to see like how it all played out and everything and how like the show was received and everything. Because honestly, like when I was reading some of these outlines and working on some of these, like it's particularly in the early season, like season one, it was kind of like we're trying to like kind of gamble. We're like, okay, we'll see how many seasons we get because we're really pushing the envelope creatively for some of the episodes we worked on. So yeah, it was fun. That's how I got started.
You talk about how Dawn, obviously, it's dealing with very mature themes like the IRS. I think that's one thing that, as somebody who was a child, basically, when regular show started, and who is now an adult, it's kind of been something of an experience going the transition from just liking it just for like the very tame jokes that were in there compared to now where like I can relate to so much more of the stuff that happens in the show. I always assumed that, oh, I'll get older and I'll just like understand some of the innuendos more. But then I realized like, oh no, there's like so much more that like I can respect and relate to now.
Uh, there's some things that I forgot. Like I'll go back and like rewatch some episodes and like there's details, not necessarily from ones I worked on, but from other ones like the other people had worked on. Because like when we worked on all our episodes, like as a crew, we would all like kind of like sit in on each other's pitches. Like we'd come in for the pitch meetings on different episodes, and like there was like a lot of things that like we all found funny that we gravitated towards. But then like as time, like you're saying, as time goes on, like I'll go back and watch an episode and be like, oh my God, I forgot we threw that detail in there. Like I think like maybe even like the same season where you saw Peeps, which was the first episode you'd mentioned you'd seen. There was that episode in season two, It's Time, where like Father Time, who's made up of all like the different clocks, like all of his clocks essentially make up his body. And like one of the clocks had like the 420 on it. I'm like, oh my God, I forgot we had that. Just little like little hints, little details like, here and there that I forgot. Oh yeah, I had that. Like it's cool. Like we had a lot of creative liberty to kind of like throw in little things that made each episode our own, and every board artist had like their own authorship essentially, I would always watch like an episode and I could tell, oh yeah, this is an episode that Toby and Calvin had worked on, or Toby and Owen had worked on, or Andres and Maddie had worked on, like every person had like their own creative voice to each episode, which is really fun. And I think that's what made it all the more enjoyable making the show, because it was like being in the pitch room. It was like watching, listening to your friends, like letting you in on like an inside joke in a way, it was really cool. So yeah, it was creative. It was fun to be creative, to try and work our way around the more adult heavy kind of jokes and more adult themes. But that's what made it more interesting to see like, okay, how can we make this that's more interesting to a kid as much as it is interesting to an adult, where like the adult can like still get something from it. So I don't know. It's been that was part of the challenge of working on the show, but it was fun.
So, for the people out there who aren't fully aware of what it is that a storyboard artist does, could you explain exactly what it is that the role entails?
Yeah, so every show kind of operates differently as far as like what they expect from like storyboards. I think the way it was run, like a lot of the shows I worked on back when I started at Cartoon Network, like especially Flapjack, because shows like Flapjack kind of set the bar for like how shows were done back then for storyboard artists versus how they're done today, because it's changed quite a bit over the years as far as like the production pipeline in particular. So a storyboard artist, like their basic job essentially is like to visualize the episode from start to finish. They're almost like comic book artists for the screen essentially, because they're breaking everything down into panels like visually shot for shot. And like, which is interesting because we actually had a lot of comic artists, like particularly like independent illustrators and independent comic artists who came on to regular show. They A lot of people whose background was more like comics than animation per se. But that made it all the more personable in terms of like how they approach like the style of the show. But the way you think, in terms of comics is a lot different than how you think in terms of like, animation, like visually in particular, because you're planning everything out very meticulously. You have to make sure everything is in continuity from shot to shot, essentially. So you're worrying about like, cutting where the character is, like when to cut wide, and, like establishing where everyone is and like figuring out logistics. So I worked with a lot of people who like came from comics and like had very unique sensibilities, but like having, learned animation and film when I was at CalArts, I worked with a lot of people who came from comics and weren't very familiar as much with like, how storyboarding worked versus like comics. So, I try to like, finesse their understanding at times. I worked with like people who like were a little more new, and when you're working in storyboards, especially when you're on a TV show like regular show, Adventure Time, Flapjack, if you're working on an 11-minute board-driven show, it's a lot more different. I will say we were very fortunate at that time because I will say not a lot of shows really operate like this anymore. Some do, but not very many. But when I was at Cartoon Network, the creative norm at the time was for like the board artists essentially not just to draw out every shot. They got to draw, but also write the dialogue. So we had writers who essentially like would conjure they'd write outlines essentially. Like I mean a lot of shows are like more script driven, like you work like a lot of like sitcom like TV shows like Family Guy or Simpsons in particular, like more like half-hour long shows that essentially require more hands and more time, or like it's a lot more like work. So they have like typically writers who like write out like the scripts and everything. So a lot of adult shows are generally more scripted, but regular show is such an exception because it was, like the creative freedom was given solely to the board artists essentially. Like we had directors who like oversaw, the finished version of the episodes, but a lot of what you see in like finished episodes of regular show, like a lot of the writing, the shots, like it's all from the board artists. Like the board artists were essentially like the main directors of the show to a degree. Like, a lot of like I said, like a lot of what came out in the finished product was very much their own touch. Like I said, like we got to write and draw. So we would have writers who wrote outlines and they kind of like they're essentially like written like summaries, like a couple pages, like, in paragraph form. So it gave like the general act one, act two, act three synopsis of how the story progressed. So, when I worked on regular show in particular, like in a lot of the shows at Cartoon Network at the time, like they were like, you get like a pair of board artists working together. Like I said, I was paired up, with more comic people who were more familiar with comics. So, they get like two people working together and we get like about a month or so to like work on the episode, and we periodically be pitching it to the directors, to JG, to people in charge. So yeah, it was a very collaborative process, and like that's where I think it's you get the best stuff because you're trying to treat it like improv in a way. At least like that's how I tried to treat the writing process, because I'd work with different people who had different kind of like styles and the way they want to work and the way they wanted to write. So, but I always like to kind of like sit down, like hash it out and figure out like line for line, like what the characters would be saying and everything. So I'd be working with like my writing partner. We'd like figure out like, the dialogue first and then kind of like go in and like figure out like, visual gags and like areas we could like punch up like the humor just like to figure out like how to make it funnier. So like we do like a whole pass of the boards, of all of the episode essentially in thumbnails. So we would get like giant ply boards, and this is a way of working that like is not very common nowadays because of, Cintiqs and, working digitally and everything. And it's, it saves on time, obviously, working digitally. But one of the benefits we had of working traditionally, because I worked my entire time on regular show from season one up until the very last season, season eight. I actually worked traditionally on everything. Like I had never converted digitally on that show. Like I did everything we did everything on Post-its. We did everything on paper Post-its. We'd like do like our thumbnail pass, with sheets of paper, and we would put up Post-its because it was a great way of seeing like chronologically from start to finish, like and getting a good sense of like the pacing of the episode, getting an understanding of like how it worked visual, how it worked like in certain terms of like visuals, like the timing of everything. Like it was a good way to see all the drawings in front of us, and in case we wanted to change things, we could just like take a Post-it and like rearrange it from like one area to another. And like I remember like sometimes we would get some outlines that were a little like not as like well thought out and as unfortunately as others. So like there were times when we had to like, work late and we'd have to go into the meeting room and like kind of like look at the board and everything and like figure out, okay, what areas need fixing and everything, and like going back and kind of having to rewrite certain things. So, it was challenging, but also like really rewarding. And like, I think that's a great way, I think, for board artists in general. Like if they're like, before they even start working digitally and figuring out like pipeline, I think like, it's a good way of like figuring out how quickly you can get down your ideas and like how you can work together and like the heat and like the spur of the moment kind of, like, and I think that's how we came up with our best ideas and like just our like, just spontaneously like, trying to figure out like, okay, what's working, what's not, like literally throwing against the wall. And it was a really fun process. I actually kind of miss like working that way. I was going through some old storyboard thumbnail pages and like seeing all the post-its and everything. Like that was like part of the charm of working on the show, actually. And a lot of the shows at the time were done that way. Like the board artists would like be like drawing post-it notes and like posting them on the walls and stuff. It was really kind of a special way of working. So yeah, it was more analog, as they say. So yeah.
And I'll say that as a creative type myself, that's exactly how regular shows inspired me.
Nice. Oh wow, look at that.
Always working on post-its, and obviously, as you've mentioned, storyboarding is very collaborative. So, what is that kind of relationship like working with everyone, and how does that all come together within a collaborative process?
I mean, every season.
Was like it was funny because when I worked on regular show, every season had its own level of surprises, whether it was like what was happening throughout the sh like throughout the trajectory of the show, like as far as like the storylines and like the character development and everything. And like I think it was like a combination of like understanding the show throughout all that time. Because like I mean, it's man, I it doesn't when I look back at like it doesn't feel like it was 60 episodes. It's so crazy to think it was that many, honestly. I'm like, oh my God, did I really do that? Like it's kind of wild, honestly. There were days I was working on the show where I'm like, how the hell are we gonna keep this going? Like it's just like there was it was such an interesting kind of journey, like seeing what we're gonna get away with throughout every episode, throughout every season, like because every season was like kind of similar, but also it became kind of different, especially towards like later seasons in particular. But every season was different and interesting and challenging in each way, and especially with like the people I worked with, because like I had a new writing partner basically every season, and like, there are some seasons I remember I kind of like bounced between different writing partners, and like sometimes were more challenging than others because like it was a lot different for some people, like I said earlier, who, didn't come from animation, they came from comics, so they were kind of like used to like working by themselves. So it was interesting getting to work with people who like, were not familiar with working with a group. But I think like I tried to like go about it like, like I took a lot from, having worked with Mike Roth. Like he really kind of like showed me the ropes, and I really wanted to like be kind of a mentor to the people that I worked with, and like, kind of try not only show them like all like the animation kind of lingo, that was different from comics, but I also wanted to like, see what they had to bring to the table, and like, learn from them too. Like I really like learned just as much from the people I worked with as they learned from me when I try to show them, all the like more technical side of boarding, and I sometimes, it was always challenging trying to figure out like what was the right joke. And sometimes, whenever you're trying to come up with an idea, the more you think about it, I feel like it becomes more labored. And sometimes like if we just kind of like let ourselves go and like just like come up with something off the cuff, sometimes a lot of the times that was like far funnier. Like sometimes when weren't even thinking, just being ourselves, just like being in the moment, and like something would come up, And I think like I try to treat, at least as far as like my writing style, like I mean, it varied with everybody I worked with. Like every season, it was like a different approach. Some people like kind of like wanted to work by themselves and write something and then show it to me afterwards, and then we'd kind of like talk it over. But then there came a point where I was like, okay, I want to try and get more involved, and like again, it depended on like how comfortable the person was, because sometimes people are a little more shy, but then there are some people, like who wanted to like kind of like treat it like improv, and I wanted to treat it like improv, like where like I would try to get into the character, get into like the moment of like the scenario of like the episode, and like imagine what Mordecai and Rigby would be saying, and like kind of like treat it like a game of yes and, where like I would say something and toss it to the other person, and they'd bring something back. So I tried to be as open to that as possible. And it was such a challenge at times, because having worked on the show for as long, at least for as long as I did, there were times where I thought like, okay, I've been on the show for a while. I feel like I should know what JG's style or what he gravitates towards, like as far as like like what he wants out of the show. Like it was always, there were times it was kind of a crapshoot. It was like, oh man, I was like, sometimes he would find something funny I would not expect, and it was like, oh wow, okay. So it was very much like kind of like, experimentation in a way, sort of. And like, because the show is just so unique and bizarre in its own way, you never know what was going to happen. And like, that was part of like the humor and fun of the show, was like, okay, something crazy is going to happen. So I tried to like be as open-minded as I could. And it was, like I said, it was very much a journey in itself, because there were times where like I thought like the show would go a certain way, and I'd be like, oh, okay, this is how it's gonna go. So yeah, it was very much experimentation, in a lot of episodes, more so than others for sure. And like I think like a lot of the earlier seasons we got away with a lot more creatively, at least like as far as like more adult theme type stuff. Like I feel like that was something they allowed us to kind of like play with a little more. But then like as things got more serious by midway through the series. I think that's when, and the show became more popular and more watched. I think that's when, the studio became a little more apprehensive about like what we could get away with and what we couldn't get away with. So we had to like kind of like not limit ourselves, but definitely be more mindful. Okay, how could we like make this fun and appealing, but also not like scare people, you know? Because there are episodes, I go back and watch some episodes. I'm like, I can't believe we got away with some of this stuff that we did. So like it was always challenging, but fun in that way. So yeah, I hope that makes sense.
And I just wanted to know, is there anything from your own life that you kind of put into the show?
Well, there's one detail that I look back on that pretty fondly. There was an episode, Busted Cart, the episode Busted Cart, and it was the one where Benson had to take like a cross-country drive just to get to like this little dinky dealership, and Mordecai and Rigby felt bad because they like fucked up the cart. So I they joined him on his journey, and he had to kind of like deal with them on like this road trip, and like they kind of like bond for like a brief second, but then like of course they like had to like take a little roadside quick pit stop to play some video games at this arcade on the side of the road. So two things. So one, regular show is very video game centric as far as like its themes and like a lot of like references that the episodes make. JG grew up, playing a lot of video games, and a lot of the generally the people who worked on the show, a lot of the crew members were pretty big on video games. So, and I kind of like I didn't have like I was one of those kids who didn't have like an actual control set. I briefly had a PlayStation like in the early thousands when I was in middle school, and I brought it from my cousin, but had to give it back. But I generally like would always play like N64 games with my friends or whatever. So like I vicariously enjoyed games through my friends because I didn't have like my own set, unfortunately. But so that as a result, I wasn't like as heavy into games growing up, but I still love them. And like some of my fondest memories of playing video games, like, especially at like arcades, was going to because I grew up in New England, in New Hampshire specifically. I grew up in the small town, New Hampshire, and not that far from where I grew up was like essentially like the mecca of like arcade video games in that area. And it was a place called a Fun Spot. So I tried to make like as like a nod to video game references from regular show. When Mordecai and Rigby veer off on the side of the road, stop at the arcade place, I changed the name to Joy Spot instead of Fun Spot. So I tried to like make a Fun Spot reference in that regard. So because I had like the logo is like a dragon or whatever, and it's like a dragon, it's like this kind of like Tony the Tiger or like Chuck E. Cheese looking kind of style dragon, and it's like I wanted to like kind of like make a nod to my childhood, but also like a nod to like video games like that I could see Mordecai, like a place I could see Mordecai and Rigby going to, and like Fun Spot was very regular show in that way, I could say for sure. So yeah.
I kind of wish I was born a bit earlier so I could have properly had the experience of arcades. I don't know how it is in the States, if there's still loads of arcades around, but in the UK there's barely anything. There's this one place, which is an arcade bar called NQ64. They actually have a Mordecai sticker outside of it. But yeah, that's the closest experience I've really been able to get.
There's a couple like
Lately, last like 10 years, like bars have come back in kind of like a retro, like kind of like nostalgic way. There's a lot of like barcades, like there's a lot of like bars out here that have like arcades, and you can like I want to say the closest thing to like an adult bar type place out here. There's like a place called like Dave and Buster's, and you can like play games and win prizes and stuff. But like that's for like drunk frat boys mostly, and like it's just like kind of like like basketball hoops type style like interactive games, and a couple like not like die hard like old school arcade like video game cabinet type places. I mean, there's been a couple that have like kind of come and gone here in LA in particular. There's been a couple like restaurants that have like arcade cabinets, like old school arcade cabinets that like integrated into them, and like they're kind of like retro themed in a way. So there's kind of like been attempts at like bringing back arcades, but like as far as like actual like legit like mall like arcades or like all like the best games, like it's hard to find those nowadays. But yeah, as far as I know, that place I mentioned near where I grew up, Fun Spot, which is still in New Hampshire. I think it's still there. It's still like a pretty big like spot because it's like kind of a very niche thing, like arcade gaming and everything. So yeah, but still there as far as I know. But yeah, it's hard to find, with everything becoming like all internet, it just everything's on the internet now. So yeah, it's like a different like era essentially. I think we wanted to like kind of show like that analog like it was funny. We worked in such an analog way on the show with working on paper and pencil and everything, and like the elements and the themes were all like analog also because they were like characters playing on like old Sega type, game systems or whatever. And like it was kind of fun to like tap into like what we liked growing up and everything. And it's funny, so much has changed, especially with like video games just in the last like, 10 years and everything, and like how I would imagine it probably feels very dated to like younger folks who are just tuning into regular show now, but in a fun way, I could see like them getting into it or like discovering it and like probably wanting to get into it on their own, which is kind of cool, I think.
I've got the Art of Regular Show book here,
Nice.
and in this book, you are quoted as saying that you designed Rigby's parents. You initially thought of typical suburban middle class families. When you finished, you realized that Rigby's dad looked very much like Ned Flanders.
Pretty much. That was like my most, I think.
Like I forget. I think maybe I had Ned Flanders on my mind specifically because I think I probably dressed up as him for Halloween that year when I worked on that particular episode where his dad shows up or whatever. I forget, but yeah, he kind of like stayed. I think that design kind of stayed with the world, the ethos, I guess. And again, like the way we approach the show, like especially in the earlier seasons, like I feel like we definitely try to instill like the early Simpsons vibe, especially like, we got to do like our own Halloween episodes, so that was like Treehouse of Horror, our take on Treehouse of Horror in a way. And like Flanders is just such a I don't know why. He's always been such an odd, interesting character to me just throughout watching The Simpsons throughout my life because I grew up on like Simpsons essentially, and I don't watch it as much as I used to. Like I haven't kept up with the newer seasons as much, but I still look back on like the older like ones from like season 3 or 4, like just all the ones from like the early 90s, and all the jokes are just like so smart and quick and witty and funny. But yeah, there was a lot of like kind of little Simpsons isms that kind of like snuck in there, and I think like the most obvious one obviously was Rigby's dad. So it's funny you have that book. I have a copy of that book here as well. So yeah. And O'Leary, I believe. She was very well connected with a lot of the people I worked with actually at the time. A lot of the people who came from, particularly in independent comics, because she had done some work with other publishers actually, and she was very good at orchestrating, getting everybody together, and she got, all the people who worked on the show, to kind of like chime in and give their 2 cents and their experience on like what it was like working on it. And yeah, it's a really cool like little look at, it's funny like I mean, it's not common to see a lot of like Cartoon Network kind of books. You see more like Disney, like Art of Disney type books as far as like animation art books that are out there. It's hard to find like Cartoon Network books, especially that are like in print or being sold right now. I can imagine it's probably a lot harder because everything's online. But yeah, I was really happy to be a part of that actually. I remember, and like it was cool talking about it and kind of like talking about all the things that we like referenced in like like the Christmas special and all these different episodes that they were talking about and everything, and like it was so cool to like see again, like seeing like it was almost like a yearbook in a way, like kind of like looking back on like each season and like what we did, and like, oh yeah, that was Exit 9B, which is like that crazy epic special that was like our 4th season. We're just like starting to do like Halloween episodes around that time. Oh no, we're just start doing Halloween episodes. We had just done our first Christmas special too that year also. So yeah, it was cool. We did a lot of different specials. It was fun, kind of like as like each season changed and as the characters were changing, especially with like all the stuff that was happening with like Margaret and Mordecai, like that whole storyline, like CJ coming into play, like Rigby going to like high school like all over again. Like all the different like storylines, like all the different plot points like that kind of came about, like and the stuff with Thomas, like that was like it was really like kind of like I was saying earlier, it was like I was being led on a journey, and like I thought I had a feeling about where things were going to go and like what was going to happen, but then sometimes I'd be like pleasantly surprised as I was working on it, like, oh, I did not expect Thomas to be a spy, like stuff like that, like just like seeing where the show would go. But yeah, um, I'd have to, yeah, I'm curious to see if they're still selling copies of the that book, but yeah. It's cool to like look back again. Like it's fun to see like all the old sketches we did, and like, looking back, it adds more to like the analog yearbook quality looking back on old post-it drawings that we used to do. So
It's also funny that you kind of compare it to a yearbook because there's a big page that's just everybody's pictures that works on the show.
I don't know if anybody had signed it or not, but yeah, we would always every year, like whenever we come out with like promotional artwork for Comic-Con, like people would like, sign each other's posters and stuff, and like it was cool. Like we would get like, our crew would get like t-shirts or merchandise like swag for the show, and it was really cool. I've had like those like fanny packs like the Mordecai and Rigby have like in the beginning, like those red fanny packs, like they gave us like our own fan like regular show like merch like fanny packs, and like I've had like a couple of them like sitting around for a while, and like I just gave some away actually, and like a bunch of old like people would do like promotional comic books and stuff. Like it was cool. Like it was interesting. Like, it was a good sign to see like merchandise come out of it, because that's when the show's doing well. Because like sadly, like a lot of other shows didn't get that kind of like recognition on Cartoon Network. It was hard to like find a lot of like merchandise in certain places. And it just depended on like if the show was getting promoted or not. And sadly, Cartoon Network like was very like choosy with like how they like picked and like chose like which shows to promote more. But yeah, regular show and Adventure Time, like we definitely we got a lot of really good promotional stuff out of it. So that was good. Like billboards, it was really cool to see like billboards of the characters and everything. That's when I knew like, okay, we're on the right track. We got a billboard finally.
Speaking of merchandise, there's Benson.
Nice.
Not Benton, it's Benson.
I know. When I was there was a couple times when I'd be pitching to JG, and he would occasionally let a little Benson slip out when he was addressing my name, and I had to remind him, and it was just like, purely habit, and it was just came with like having worked on the show for so long, and it was occupational hazard. But yeah, it was fun.
Another thing that you briefly mentioned then that you say in the book is about all the different movie references. Is there a specific reference which you put into the show which you were really proud of, like sneaking into there?
I mean, there were so many different.
Different episodes that like made me think of different movies in different ways, and like I think like the man, there's so many like random movies I would try to like instill into like random scenes that like had nothing to do with like what was happening. Like I remember like like there were scenes in like like in the episode from season 2, like Muscle Woman, where we meet Muscle Man's girlfriend Starla for the first time. Like I remember like throwing as many Jurassic Park references when she's like chasing them throughout the city and everything, like just stuff like that. And that was something like I'm very much a fan of like action movies like Jurassic Park, like old like 90s movies like that, and like some big like John Carpenter like movies like Big Trouble in Little China. Like those are also like movies JG really liked, and I would try to throw in some John Carpenter references to like Big Trouble in Little China here and there. There was like one episode where like we did like this whole like it was like Mordecai and Rigby like they were like at a Chinese restaurant, and like they like got some curse from like a fortune cookie, and they ended up like confronting like this wizard who looks exactly like the guy from Big Trouble in Little China at the very end. And that was a fun reference to try and like, it was very obvious, was what movie it was from if you had known the movie. We definitely like put in a lot more like obscure like 80s movies in some episodes, like one episode in particular that was a little more obscure like as far as like 80s movies is like the episode Over the Top, where it was like the whole episode was like, the name itself was like the movie like over the top, and it was like referencing arm wrestling. And because it's the episode where like Skip's arm wrestles death in order to save Rigby's life, and that was such a obscure movie. There were some movies like because I grew up watching a lot of like random movies. Like I remember like movies like there was one movie that we referenced in another episode called it was called Video Game Wizards, and we referenced a movie called The Wizard, and they made a reference to like the Power Glove in that episode in that movie, and like that was a movie I vaguely remember when I was really young. Sometimes I would watch movies that like I randomly would see like growing up as a kid, and like there were movies that JG really liked, like The Wizard was one, Goonies was a big one. Goonies was like a really big influence on him, but like on JG in particular. But that movie Over the Top, I had never heard of or seen until I worked on that episode. So I kind of like got a bit of an education from like watching certain movies certain times. Weekend at Benson's was a big obvious take on Weekend at Bernie's. Like that was like, taking like a guy who was like clearly like inanimate and couldn't move, and like they're trying to like puppeteer him. So that was like funny to try and see like what we could get away with that was both parodying the movie but also like making it feel like it was still within the regular show universe, like it was still our own like take on a movie or whatever. We didn't want to like make it so it was like an obvious movie reference, like haha, this is the movie, but like we wanted to make it so it was like something that was like kind of like slipped in, like like as an afterthought, but still like you could, if you really had seen a certain movie enough times, you could be able to tell, oh, it's referencing Big Trouble in Little China or The Wizard or whatever, so or Over the Top. So yeah, it was. I as far as which movie I could pinpoint, because I love so many different movies. Like I am kind of a bit of a movie buff in that regard. So like I have like a lot of different favorite movies in that case, and like I feel like looking back on each episode I worked on, it's like, oh yeah, I made the reference to this movie, and I like it for that reason or whatever. So I'm a big like Lord of the Rings fan, so I did a lot of like particular Lord of the Rings references in the Christmas special, because there was like references to like them taking the ring to Mordor, like to throw into Mount Doom or whatever, and I made that obvious reference of Muscle Man like hitting the cursed birthday present with a hammer, the way that Gimli does with the ring in the Fellowship of the Ring. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, like figuring out how to get creative with movie references in that way. So yeah.
And another movie reference, which I don't know if it was from you or Sam in Meet the Seer, but one of you got Mark Hamill to finally say, I've got a bad feeling about this.
I think like that was something that even our writers, because I think like at the time I remember like some of our writers who, especially the one like we had a couple writers who came on a little later on season 8, which was the whole season where everything took place in outer space, which was a very bizarre season. That was the season where I was like, okay, I guess I'm just gonna like really like let the journey take me, like because like there are so many seasons where I worked on, like episodes that I could tell, like I said, I was like, okay, I have a pretty good idea of where this is going, where things are going to happen between Mordecai and Margaret or Mordecai and CJ, trying to like predict what was going to happen as we were working on it, essentially. That's how I tried to treat it. But when I worked on all like the latter, like everything on season 8, that was like all like sci-fi outer space, kind of like themed. So I think a lot of like like the people, like the writers who wrote the outlines, as well as the board artists who worked on the episodes, we all try to like throw in all like the different sci-fi elements from TV shows and movies that we like, like Star Trek or movies that I like, but like Aliens or Starship Troopers and classic Star Wars. So I think like we had a lot of Star Wars that was very much on our minds. I'm sure at the time we wanted to make that very obvious for Mark Hamill, who voiced Skips, obviously. So that was a fun little reference there. And there was a lot of like Star Wars. We tried to be subtle with our Star Wars references, not to upset Mark, not to like, not to like beat over the head, like, hey, you did Star Wars, like we try to like make, references, but not like make it so it was like we're trying to cross it over or anything like that. We don't want to get sued.
And I mean, kind of on the topic of pop culture references, obviously there were regular shows quite infamous for having a quite large array of licensed music. Um, were there any songs that you wanted to be put in episodes that you just weren't able to get the rights for it, or?
It's a good question because
Um, I remember early on, like when we were pitching, especially when we were working on certain episodes, and I mean, like I could name like 9 out of 10 episodes like per season, like that had like montages. Like I feel like every, at least if not every episode, like at least every other episode that I would work on per season, like every episode like almost had like one or two montages happening. So that was part of the creative challenge, like especially when I was working with a writing partner and we were trying to come up with ideas on how to like present the montage, and like we were trying to like always figure out like song references and like songs that we could like play while we were pitching it. And like a lot of the times, if they were like copywritten songs like that came out at a certain time, like especially if they were like 80s songs, it was a lot harder to like get songs, whatever, because there were record companies that we couldn't get from. But like there came a point actually when we were working at Cartoon Network and we actually did get licensing agreements from Warner, like Time Warner, like Warner Records or whatever. They were able to get like rights to some episode, like for some pieces of, not every, not like, we couldn't get like big artists, like, from like we couldn't get like, well-known artists that were more like recent per se. Like we couldn't get like Nirvana or anybody like that. I remember like JG and a lot of, people who worked on the show, like we wanted to get like songs from like Led Zeppelin or Rush or like bigger 80s bands like that, but that was a lot harder because there were bigger bands that were part of big record labels. So we were able to get some like random 80s songs here and there that were like bought by Warner Brothers, thankfully. Like some songs really like sold in the moment more than others for certain episodes, like I mean, whenever we would like try and think up a song for like an episode for a montage, like and we'd pitch the song, like we'd pitch the montage with like the song, like we'd play the song on our computer or whatever when we were pitching it in the pitch room. And like we were like hoping to get it, and instead we'd get like it was cool actually to see because we worked with a really, Mark Mothersbaugh and his band Mutado. They did the music for regular show, and they like did really cool renditions like of like song, like they would do. I remember they did like we like pitched a song that sounded like a Devo song, so it was like extra interesting to see, like them recreating like a song they had already done from like the 80s with Devo, like it was really fun to see like kind of like retellings of different songs that we liked, and like I don't know, it was fun. I remember towards the end, like I remember there was one episode I worked on in season 8. I think it was like Rigby in space, and he was like getting like harassed by a Spacey McSpace tree, if I recall. That was a really weird. That was a weird episode. That was a weird character, but yeah, it was like this like mascot who was like all about safety, and he was like trying to get Rigby to be safe all the time, and during the montage, I had pitched like the safety dance for obvious reasons, like the song "You Can Dance If You Want to," and like it was like it's very iconic. It was a little lesser known 80s song, but definitely like if you listen to it and remember it, you recognize it. But like I remember pitching that song for an episode, and it was gonna go through. But then I found out actually, it was for the finale actually of all things. So I found out that of all like the songs we're trying to get the rights for, we ended up getting the rights to a David Bowie song, which was Heroes. And that was what the song we ended up using for like the very last episode for season 8, for the series finale that we ended, which was pretty monumental as far as like, like I said, like we couldn't, it was a little harder to get like songs from like bigger artists. So getting a song from like David Bowie was kind of a big deal. It's for like an 11-minute cartoon show on Cartoon Network, like to get like music from an artist like David Bowie, who isn't really like, I mean, you wouldn't imagine younger kids get knowing him very well, but like, for like broader audiences, like to have gotten a song from somebody like him, like at that time, like that was actually like a pretty big win for us. That was a really big win. And
And that episode only came out just 1 year after he died as well.
you're right, actually. Yeah. That's crazy how the timing was. I remember when that happened. Like I had found out I was actually working. I was just about to work I had just finished that episode you mentioned actually, Meet the Seer, right around the time he died actually in 2016, like early 2016, around that time. That was right when I was working on Meet the Seer and just going into the finale actually. And I had found out about like I'll be honest, as far as like, celebrity deaths, like that was one that definitely kind of like really like, like made me sad. I having, listened to a lot of Bowie in high school and college, and I feel like Bowie was very much a creative influence all throughout regular show, especially, characters like, referencing Gary. Gary was an obvious influence from obviously influenced by David Bowie. So like I think it was really like extra special and even more so like to like not only get like to reference him but to get like one of his songs for like the last episode and everything and like I think they were initially going to go with the safety dance, but because we got the rights to Bowie, we ended up going with the Bowie song instead of the safety dance. So I'm glad we went with Bowie. I was like, oh, that's one song I'm happy to let go. I think to this day, like I still look back, I'm like, man, like that's probably one of the best uses of that song ever. Not just, and I'm not saying that just because I worked on regular show, but I think for a TV show to use like a David Bowie song, I'm so glad we got to use like that particular, that song, like Heroes. Like that was very like it brought the emotion and it brought like the whole like tone of regular show to like a very good climactic finish, I thought. So yeah.
In terms of the safety dance, I felt it was kind of obvious that was the song that was supposed to play because there's a few bits within the montage that seem to be very clearly referencing the music video.
If you go back and watch like music videos to like 80s song, especially 80s songs in particular, if you go back and watch like music videos to like some 80s songs, a lot of music videos are really random and really weird. Like a lot of them are like just like the music artist like, just singing and like kind of like nodding and like he's just standing there trying to look cool. But like sometimes you'd watch a music video from the 80s and they were like it almost felt like a random scene from like a film like that you'd never heard of, like just like random like the safety dance music video is so bizarre because it's like it opens on like a field, like some like provincial, like it feels like a fairy tale almost, like it's like a Brothers Grimm story. And it's like this like little person like dressed up as like a jester and he's like dancing around like it's like something out of like a really it's almost like a cartoon in itself in a way. So I try to like channel that into like that moment in that montage, like yeah. And I think like sometimes if you want to like make it so okay, like so when you're turning in an episode, like whenever we would like pitch an episode with a particular song in mind, we would like reference the song name. And thankfully, like Mark Mothersbaugh, the composer, like they would do a good job like kind of matching like the song. So yeah, I definitely laced in some safety dance visuals here and there with like the jester character. Yeah.
And also, you might not have been able to get it for that episode, but in the UK, back around the time regular show started, there was a commercial where they used safety dance and they had the characters basically using dialogue from the show. It was for both regular show and Adventure Time, using different characters saying the words of the song.
Wow. Glad to know that.
It's allowing people to discover it. That's cool. I think that's like it's always funny because that's the thing I like about animation. Like it can make references to live action that like again, going back to Simpsons, like when I was a kid and I remember like discovering like the movie The Shining for the first time. Like if it weren't for The Simpsons, I would never have known what The Shining was because like I've discovered The Shining through like that very iconic Halloween episode of The Simpsons that's like called The Shinning. It's making fun of The Shining and like I did not know anything about Stanley Kubrick when I was a kid, so like seeing shows make more like adult, like more like, more adult film references like that, or more like, like films you wouldn't normally see as a kid. Like I think there's something kind of special where like it brings you on to that and it kind of like allows you to like broaden your tastes for like film or TV or whatever. So yeah. I think that's like, and even if you go back and like watch like, early Looney Tunes from like back in the day, like Looney Tunes from like the 40s, they would like make caricatured references to like stars of the time, like parody like Frank Sinatra or somebody like that from back then. So yeah, it was I think there's something cool about like instilling like live action film or like, more adult like type stuff into like a kid's cartoon. I don't know.
Just one additional thing from the Art of Regular Show. You said in the book that the favorite drawing you ever did on the show was a back shot of Don looking at Rigby, um, yelling at him because he was at his birthday party and he didn't want him there. Has that changed since then? Do you look back at what your favorite drawing from the show is now and think of something different, or is it still that?
No,
After all this time and after having worked on like, thankfully I was very fortunate to work on all seasons from season one up until season eight. But I gotta say, even after all this time, even after the show and everything, like in all these years, like I look back, that is still by far my favorite drawing. I don't know why. I just like there was something because I remember when I did that episode, like that episode in particular was like, I mean, when I worked on Flapjack, I definitely felt like, okay, I can definitely like keep like riding the wave of like working on these Cartoon Network shows because I really loved working on them and I loved being part of like that Cartoon Network renaissance at the time, between shows like Adventure Time and regular show. But like there's something like I remember going from when I was going from Flapjack to regular show, I remember thinking, oh, regular show is like so unique and different. I hope I can get the humor or the style of the show. And I remember like working on Dawn and like I remember reading the outline for it and reading what, the dialogue that JG had written already, him and Kat Morris, because they had already like kind of dipped into the episode like halfway through. And I kind of like came on kind of late and try to like kind of pick up the pieces. So I did a lot of like the scenes, like the more character heavy pieces were like, the scenes where like Don is on the computer and Rigby's like being such a jerk to him and everything. And like all the scenes were like he's just being a jerk to his loving brother. Cause like I remember like when I was a kid, like that scene where like he's having his birthday party. I remember like when I was really young, when I was like a toddler, I remember like throwing a tantrum, like, I don't want you here. Like I remember like yelling at like my one relative or whatever, and like I try to like lace those like chaotic birthday parties from like my youth into like that scene in Dawn where like Rigby's like, guys, 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 it's being like really annoying and like his brother's just chilling in the basement, like, hey bro, like and I remember doing that drawing and it's like I try to like encapsulate Rigby's like rage, like what? And just this visual of like his brother, like, because I love the idea of like his brother being younger than him and like being taller. So like I thought it was just like a funny idea, like, oh, it's just like literally like showing like his brother is like the more dominant presence in this episode. So I thought just that back view of him like holding the door open at the basement entrance and like Rigby in the background, like far back. He's like, I told you to stay. Like he's like yelling at him. So I did that drawing and it got a big laugh, I remember, from people. And like my Mike Roth, who was the supervisor at the time, he helped me get on the show, thankfully. And him and JG were trying to see if I could like wing the humor and get the sense of the show. And I remember when Mike came in and saw that drawing of Don in the back and or the foreground and Rigby in the back, like he chuckled. And like to this day, I still think about that. And it's still my favorite drawing for sure. And like, it kind of like also like having worked on so many episodes and drawn so many random crazy ass scenes over the years and so many different episodes and different seasons, like I still like look at that particular moment very, very fondly. And it's like there's something really magical and like kind of like special about like looking back on like the very early regular show episodes, especially in season one, like and it felt very raw and like just like the drawing itself I did, just like thinking about, not even thinking about it, it almost just like came to me. Like it just like kind of like through my experiences and just like through like that story and like figuring out Dawn, like it just like, I don't know, it became like a moment that kind of like stayed with me. And I look at that drawing still and I chuckle. So yeah.
Another thing which, and I'm not even sure if you're aware of this, but you worked on every Christmas special. Which of those would you say is your favorite?
It's funny. Like I mean, I say this about like all the episodes I worked on because like I really do enjoy every episode for what it is, its own thing. Like there's a lot of different reasons why I like or, even dislike or whatever. There's episodes that like I remember more distinctly than others because they were referencing something that was very specific to me at the time, or I don't know. I look back on especially the Christmas ones because those were like a lot. Those were a lot as far as like story wise. Those were a lot more involved and like more like they're specials obviously, so they're more unique and fun. And they're all what was fun was like they were different in their own way. Like they were it was fun getting to do regular show in a holiday, like the holiday version of regular show, if that makes sense. Like it was because the first one I did was the epic, like the half-hour long Christmas special. Like, and that was actually like that one's like definitely like my all-time favorite. I look back on that one and I love how I did, I was very proud of the opening that I did for that. There was a lot of great very action heavy scenes that I was very happy with that I did for that one, the for the Christmas special, the half-hour long one with Santa, and them trying to get rid of the gift. That was one that was very true to like my sensibility. Like I really wanted to like do an edgier like because that one like we got to like essentially take all the elements of a Christmas special, but take them to the next level by making it more like action packed and edgy and like making it feel like an action movie in a way, kind of like Die Hard in a way, sort of. But I think one episode that's still honestly as far as all the Christmas specials I worked on, I like that one a lot, but my personal favorite, and to this day, it's kind of like my surprise favorite in a way, because at the time when I worked on it, I didn't really think much of it. It felt like just another typical episode. It didn't feel like a Christmas special, but the one I worked on was White Elephant Gift Exchange. Like that is actually a very special one in particular because not just because it was a Christmas special, but because it was referencing a custom that we as a crew on regular show, like all the crew members who worked on the show, we actually did white elephant gift exchanges every year during our Christmas potlucks, actually. So like we have been doing like I remember like probably around like midway through our series through like around like season 3 up until like towards the end, like that's around the time we started like having crew Christmas get-togethers, like once the show became more established, like every and the show thankfully had good job security, like every Christmas was like something to look forward to because like we'd have our own Christmas party, and like we would do like a potluck where all the crew members would bring their own like food and different dishes to the get together and everything. And it was really fun in that regard. But we'd also have like our own ritual where we'd actually like bring like random gifts, like things that we would never want to buy our loved ones, but like we just thought would be funny as like a get, like as a joke gift to like people on our crew or whatever. Like people would bring in like, random like household appliances, like somebody brought in like plastic grapes from like IKEA or whatever, like just like random stuff like that. And I brought like a action figure. It was like a Rocky Balboa Sylvester Stallone action figure that I got from like a discount store. And it was like we would just get like all kinds of random stuff and give it to each other. And like that was just like our typical Christmas thing. And then it wasn't until I think season 6 is when it came out that I got the outline. It was just White Elephant Gift Exchange. I'm like, oh my God, it's art, it's life, imitating art. And just like it was a fun opportunity to like really like kind of treat it like a really big prank heavy episode. It felt like a very typical like almost like old school season 1 episode of regular show, like where we got to like have like a lot of like hijinks and like Muscle Man like kind of pranks. And it was fun because the tables were turning on him now, so it was fun getting to like have the characters try to like get really like mischievous in a way. And it wasn't like your typical like oh like warm-hearted like like old-fashioned Christmas feeling. It was more like oh we're getting together to like prank our buddy. It was very much of the style of regular show, and I think that's why I look back on it like very fondly, because I didn't think as I was working on it, like I didn't think like it would go anywhere or like be anything memorable. But like once like the episode came out, like like on Christmas, and like people like really they really like reacted, especially to the part with Muscle Man opening his gift at the very end, which was like the ultimate climax. I was trying to like reference like Jackass, like the movie, like all those like slow motion like moments in the movie Jackass, or like the show Jackass, where like all the characters were like spilling all kinds of stuff on each other and like all these like crazy pranks were happening. So I remember thinking, man, this is not a Christmas special that I would you'd think like would be like traditional, and I think that's part of the reason I like it. And I look back and that actually, I will say that that episode in particular was nominated for an Emmy, which was also a nice surprise. That was a big surprise to all of us. Like, oh, we didn't think that because the other Christmas special, like the first one I worked on, that was also nominated, and we thought like, okay, yeah, that was a little more like feature, kind of like was trying to be more like feature heavy, but like this was just like a typical like episode. Was White Elephant, and I think it was really kind of cool that it got recognized for that, and I think it was just because it was so of its kind. I think people liked it for that reason, so that's why it's special too. So yeah.
And another bigger story which you worked on, of course, you additionally boarded scenes for the movie. So, how was the process of boarding that compared to boarding the show? Was it basically the same, or was it a little bit different because it was a movie?
Um, well, the movie actually went through a lot of different kind of iterations, so to speak. Like, that movie, the way we initially kind of went about it, like all the board artists, like JG, like picked, a couple different board artists from like, who had worked on a couple of the seasons, and like, we kind of treated it like the way we'd treat our regular episodes, like our it was very outline driven, so to speak. So we had writers who like wrote the synopsis, and it was very, very in depth. It was a lot more dense starting out. Like we treated it like we normally treated like our typical 11-minute episodes, in which case we'd have an outline and we had the board teams like work together, and we'd all like kind of go off and work on different sections of the movie. So it was essentially like a free for all. I remember like because we would like have pitches, and like I remember like recording some of the pitches because some of them were kind of long, and like we were like pitching various scenes. So we were all kind of like it wasn't like in order, unfortunately. So it was like different parts of the movie. We kind of like did it like in a bit of a free for all at first. So we all kind of like put our like one giant creative pass, and it kind of changed quite a bit actually, I remember. So it started out we treated it like in a way that was, the same process as how we treated it like for an 11 minutes episode. But then like as we started to get more notes from the network, and we started to see like, we wanted to change some like things of the story. Like I think they changed, halfway through we added the storyline in where like the villain was like a coach or whatever. Like we changed it was very like we knew like certain elements we wanted to do. Like we wanted to do like a sci-fi like type scenario where like we see Mordecai and Rigby in the future. It was like very Back to the Future Part Two. We wanted to do that for sure. And they were like they decided, they wanted to change some things with like the villain, a lot of like the timeline kind of stuff, the stuff with like the time travel elements were getting a little tedious. So we wanted to like try and iron out some of the details. So halfway through, we got the writers who wrote the outlines. We decided to go into like script mode. So, like for instance, like the way we worked on regular show for an 11-minute episode, we had outlines. So normally for feature, like they have like actual writers like script out the dialogue, verbatim, essentially, word for word. So we treated it like we were writing we got like some lines, that were our own essentially from the board artists. But, to make it easier, like to even out like some of the plot holes here and there, they decided to like kind of like go into script mode. So they scripted out like, a good chunk of the movie and like rewrote some of the scenes. There was a lot of stuff that the board artists had done though initially, like, some of the scenes were like, they meet each other for the first time, like, and Mordecai and Rigby meet their like future versions of themselves. Like there was a lot of like different elements, like the stuff with the volleyball players. That was like stuff that we as a board artists, like, one of our board artists, Andres, he had figured out like some really fun gags with like uh that one like volleyball jock guy like Jablonski or whatever. Like he came up with a lot of really fun scenarios and characters for when they're in high school and everything. So there's a lot of things that we did early on that kind of like stayed, thankfully, but like a lot of things that also changed. Like that's what happens typically when you work on a feature. Like it's always constantly evolving. It's never like set in one thing. Like when you're working on an 11-minute episode, you're given only a certain amount of time, and you're given a certain amount of time to like tell a story in a certain like structure and a certain flow within 11 minutes. And like it's a lot different when you're working, you're figuring out like how to like make something, feel like it's an episode of regular show, but it's like also like an hour long, and you're trying to figure out a good like, act one, act two, act three, good trajectory of like how the story will run. So that's what the downside of working on like a very like involved plot. Like I'm really happy with like the storyline of the movie in particular, because I like how it's very much like Back to the Future. It's very much in theme with like, elements of like what make regular show like its own thing, but it was definitely a challenge creatively trying to like kind of like figure out how to like, tell it in like a succinct like way that was like, it felt like an episode of the show, but also it was like, you know, a lot more engaging and a lot more like high stakes in a way. And like I think we learned a lot, in the process, and like what to do and what not to do and everything. And like, it was cool trying to like kind of it was very much a hybrid of the way we worked for TV and trying to figure out like, okay, this is what feature artists have to go through, like they have to like constantly reboard and board everything over and over. And it's really cool. It was really fun to see like the finished film all together. I remember they had like a very special screening. They rented out a theater, an independent theater in downtown LA at the time when we were working on the show. We got the crew together and we all got to see the movie on the big screen. It was really cool. So yeah.
And I believe that if the people watching or listening or reading are interested, then some of the pictures I believe you can find on the regular show movie DVD.
Yeah, I believe there's some.
I mean, some behind the scenes. I think some videos that we took of ourselves pitching. I'm sure some made it in like the behind the scenes features. But yeah, I think you can check those out. I know I have a couple of videos that I took personally from some of those meetings from back in the day. It's so weird that I look back on like my old artwork and like all the stuff I did on the show, and like even like going back on like old video and photos. It's like again, it's like a time capsule, like a yearbook, and it's fun seeing. It's like, like old home movies in a way. It's like home videos of like it's really cool. But yeah.
So I mean, we just kind of spoke about things that never made it into the movie. Were there any scenes from any of the episodes that you did that you really wanted to make it through, but it just didn't really work out that way?
Well,
There was one episode, there was a Halloween episode I worked on actually, where the ending was quite different from what I had initially boarded. Actually, if you look it up, I believe you could still find it if you Google it, maybe like. But the one I had worked on was the one with Mordecai's uncle coming back from the dead or whatever. Like his uncle is like a ghost or whatever, and like he's haunting him because he owes him money or something like that. It was such a weird like story, like so many like random but slightly relatable stories, like owing your uncle some money or whatever, owing a family member money. Like that's such a odd thing to like get haunted about. But anyway, so I remember that was the episode. So I that was one of the Halloween segments I worked on with Hillary Florido at the time. And I remember like we did like some of the interstitial moments where they were like I think that was the Halloween special where we showed them all the park characters like they're dressed up in Halloween costumes, and they were like on their way to like a Halloween party, and they were like telling each other like stories in like the car ride or whatever. So I remember pitching a version of the end where or like a part where like they get into like an accident like halfway through like the episode, and they're like getting picked up by like a tow truck drive, like they're getting their van is getting towed or whatever, so they're like getting a ride with like the tow truck driver, and they're still telling stories. So like I did a version, I remember, where it was like the very end, like after like the last story, like they are in the truck with the tow truck driver, and they come upon like their van, like, hey, that looks like our van that got fucked up or whatever. And like they see essentially they see like themselves dead. So it's revealed that like they're ghosts on like they're getting a ride with the tow truck driver, and it's revealed that the tow truck driver is a ghost too. And like they get like driven to like hell essentially from the tow truck driver. Kind of dark actually looking back on it. And like I remember pitching that and that was another scene I had no idea if it was going to go through or not. And because there were so many other scenes of like from different episodes I had worked on. Like one in particular that I'm still amazed got away was the Christmas special, like the opening of the very first Christmas special where that elf was like fighting Santa and like shot him, like stuff like that. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe we got away with. So this was a scene where like I thought, okay, I'll try and have fun. And it was written in the outline originally where like they see themselves, they're dead and they see themselves outside their bodies. And like I wrote and I boarded that and I had some fun because like I got to like, draw them going into like a portal, to hell or whatever. It was very much like typical regular show, like getting sucked into like a vortex or whatever. But I guess the network was just like not happy with like how dark it was. They were not really having like the ending. So I remember they made it like a lot more cartoony and fun actually, because they did still have them get into a car accident again at the very end. And they show up at like the house they were supposed to go to, and then they come out, but like they're ghosts, but they look like high five ghosts in a way. Like the lower half of their bodies are like cartoony, like little stubs. Like it was a lot more like kid friendly than what I had done initially. Because what I had done was like way more like a horror movie. Like, they were like with this truck driver who like reveals himself to be like this like skeleton demon. It was like something out of like Pee-wee's Big Adventure, like Large Marge. Like, he's like getting like taken by this like creepy like tow truck driver. But yeah, it was way more like I we try to play up, a lot of us who worked on the Halloween episodes, we tried to like go for broke and see how much we could get away with and like push the horror elements. And that was like one of the darker scenes, like because like some of the other episodes were a lot dark, pretty dark. Like the haunted house one had a lot of like crazy stuff in it, and I wanted to like try and push, more like Halloween horror elements with that. But yeah, I think that executives were like, yeah, we can't. I think that was around the time they realized, yeah, we can't do like dead bodies or whatever, or like very morbid elements. They try to stay away from that. But yeah, I think it was a fun creative solution to see like what they did differently. I was a little bummed because they changed it obviously from what I had done, but like it was interesting to see like what they decided to go with instead, and like I could see why they did it. Like because they wanted to make them look like high five ghosts. So it was a lot more like friendlier and fun. So yeah.
What would you say was your biggest challenge with being a storyboard artist on a regular show?
So in a way,
It had its own set of challenges, I think, and it was just like figuring out, okay, what element of humor do we want to play up? What part of like the character, like what personality trait or what aspect of the character do we want to like really like hone in on, or like what we want to like sell here. Um, I don't know. Again, every episode was like its own unique creative challenge in a way, and like I think going back, I look at old episodes and I'm like, oh man, I can't believe there's sometimes I look back, I'm like, I can't believe I did that. But then there's also times I'm like, oh, I wish I could have done it like this. I mean, there's always like I think that's like just like what happens when you're an artist is like you're always like wanting to like figure out how to like change and like make things better and like, push things and push the envelope. And I think like man, it was a very like, every episode had like its own. I think the biggest challenge personally, I mean, like drawing wise, there are like definitely like, logistical things in terms of like figuring out like how things are going to be presented, like certain action scenes or like, what we want, different ideas we wanted to sell during a montage, like what, because every episode had very, relatable elements happening with the characters, but then they were also going to be veering off into like more visually interesting and bizarre, elements, like having the magical elements like coming in like towards like the third act of the episode, like having like one minute you're having characters talk about relationship problems, the next minute they're like in another dimension talking to like inanimate objects or whatever. And like there was always challenges like figuring out like how to sell visually like what was going to happen, like I remember like, like figuring out like when Mordecai and Rigby, I did the episode, or no, I did the episode where Mordecai and Margaret finally kissed for the first time after like 3 seasons of Mordecai being a complete chicken about it. Like I remember that was an interesting episode because we had to figure out like visually how to represent like the friend zone, like figuring out like very like kind of like ideas and like kind of like figuring out like almost like concepts that you could see and like read on like a sheet of paper, but like you're not sure visually how they would play out. So like we definitely try to like come up with ideas and like how to visually represent like the friend zone and how it was like, this region in space that was like the Milky Way or like some uncharted territory where it's like something out of like Superman where like those prisms, like those like futuristic like windows into like other realms or portals like where like characters are like trapped or it's like trying to figure out like the very like kind of like the subtext in a way. You're trying to figure out like the subtext of the story, like the very unconscious inner feelings of like the story or like or what the character is going through. You're figuring out like those like um those inner conflicts. You're figuring out like what's happening with those characters and like you're kind of trying to figure out a way to visually represent like what they're going through, that like the friend zone and like when Margaret stuff like that and when Margaret like visits Mordecai at the holiday party and like they have that awkward encounter with like CJ being there and everything and Mordecai's trying to get over Margaret and like he has this moment where he like gets the disco ball like in this like in the party punch or whatever and like it fucks up and it goes into like it gets all haywire and like it shoots out all these lasers and Margaret is like multiplied like stuff like that like just like figuring out like visually how to like sell like moments in an episode that like were like very integral to the story and like okay how do we like make it so it's like trying to like represent like what the character is going through essentially. So that was I think a challenge in itself because regular show had very like relatable and like very personable stories that like you could as a viewer hopefully like if you're like a young teen or like somebody who's like coming of age like you're trying to find a job or you're trying to like make friends or you're trying to like date around or whatever, I think like we had like a lot of very grounded human elements, but we also try to like push it visually because that was part of the show's appeal, is like because they're cartoons. We wanted to like have like, characters who are like inanimate objects who are like feeling really human things and like they were like going through these weird changes and stuff. And I think like it was cool and challenging to figure out like how to like sell the magical elements throughout every episode because they all changed and they got more like because the more like creatively charged we got with the show, especially as the series went on towards like season 8 and like it went into like outer space in particular, like that's when like it was like full on like okay, it's like the third act of an episode. They're not in like the real world, so it's like okay, how do we make it so it's like a lot of crazy things happening all the time, but it's like still like interesting and still like grounded, so that was finding that balance between like relatable humor and also like cartoony imaginative elements. That makes sense. That was a challenge. Yeah.
What would you say are some of your favorite memories of your time working on the show?
I mean, yeah, it was such a different way of, I mean, compared to like how the shows that I've worked on like recently and like just how things have changed since those days of Cartoon Network and just I really look back on that time. It was a really special time to be honest. Like I really enjoyed like, each season brought something new and different and it felt like very familiar, but also like it all brought changes and something special every step of the way. I felt like it was really, yeah, I thought there were points throughout the series where I thought, I think I got it figured out, but I always kind of found something new to discover, and that was something that was really special about it. And it was like kind of like being in school again, but in a way that was like I was working on something that like it felt very much like a show that was true to my heart, and like to find a show like that, it's hard to find, especially nowadays. It's a lot of shows have come and gone over the years, and like to find a show that you creatively connect with, on a personal level, and as far as like the type of references it makes, like I really feel like it was really there's a lot of great memories I can look back on, every different season. I look back on like all the thing, all the times I worked with different people. I worked with like, certain people that like, brought something new to the table, and like I would always like come up with ideas, and like every year was so different and fun. Like, and I think the more memorable parts were definitely like the holiday parties, like all the crew get-togethers, and like everybody, like gathering as a crew, and like all like the movie screening, the regular show movie screening. Um, it was a really fun. I think one thing I missed the most, and I still look back on fondly, and it's just probably because I don't do it as much anymore, is because everything's digital now, is like working traditionally, and like putting post-its up on the board, and like going through pitches, and like working with somebody in the room, and like looking stuff up and coming up with stuff on the fly. Like I really miss like that very collaborative, integral process of boarding, and like having to work that way, and like just the feeling of drawing on post-its. It was such a unique way of working, and it was so unlike, like compared to like how things are done nowadays. Like it was such a aspect of like working on those shows that made it feel like its own thing, and it was really special. So yeah, I just come into work and sitting at my desk and just like going over post-its and everything, like just like it was great. I had like a electric eraser that was like clipped to my desk, and I would like it was attached to like one of those zip line things that you would like put your badge on or whatever, like, and it was like I could like pull it down. It was like a little like sliding thing. It was like zzz. It was like it was fun. Like it was just like working traditionally I really miss, and that was a really special part of working on regular show. And we even reference it in like the finale when like everything comes apart, and like they become like posted sketches and everything. Like we made a lot of like kind of like self references to the way we worked towards the end. I remember it was really fun. But yeah, I really enjoyed, every person I worked with. It was a unique experience, and like just like all the different episodes throughout every season. And it was just I learned a lot. It was a lot of fun.
Beyond regular show, you also worked briefly on Close Enough.
Yeah. That was an interesting time because I was finishing up on regular show, and I was already actually doing development for Apple and Onion. I was helping that series get off the ground. And but I did have a chance to do they were just literally in the very, very early stages of development for Close Enough at that time. I was also developing Apple and Onion though, so they were like just getting Close Enough going. And I was doing a lot of double duty at the time as a result, because I was helping out on Apple and Onion, but also finishing up in regular show. And once I finished in regular show, I got to do the first episode, or yeah, I think the first episode of Close Enough I worked on. Yeah. And that had changed. Like after I had worked on it initially, it had changed quite a bit. Like a lot of the characters actually were a lot different than how they turned out to be actually. Like I said, it was still in its early like character development phase, and like they had changed it quite a bit even after I had worked on Close Enough. But that was a fun one actually. That was a really fun. The episode that I worked on was particularly fun because they were trying to be more like adult centric, more like adult themed with that particular show. And regular show was already kind of like walking that line between like being full adult and being, kid friendly. And I think like looking back, I think it was creatively challenging to try and come up with something that worked for both adults and kids working on regular show. But like now that I've worked on like more adult heavy shows, it's like, okay, now like what's more adult, and like, it's the contrast is there, so to speak. So it was funny because I was drawing in the regular show style, and I got to like do something more adult heavy. Like I had like the characters like smoking weed, them going to like a dispensary for the first time, getting interviewed, and like figuring out like, which is something I've actually done before in real life, living out in California, of course. So yeah, but it was fun getting a chance to like be a little more free, and it was more cathartic in that way to like embrace the more adult heavy side of an adult show, kind of, having worked on more kids theme shows for regular show, and, Blackjack and stuff. But yeah, it was interesting in that regard. But yeah, after that, that was like my first initial introduction, because I've been mostly working on adult shows ever since. Like I worked on Big Mouth most recently.
I mean, I remember when Close Enough was first revealed, and then eventually when it came out, watching like the first episode and being like, this feels like regular shows back, but it's matured like as I've matured as well. And yeah, it was great. I wish that there was more.
think came out at a weird time because like I mean like Cartoon Network has gone through a lot of changes as a network itself, you know, with like its viewing and everything and like the way they've handled shows and everything. And I mean, I think because I remember they were trying to like have close enough done for TBS, and that was, you know, initially intended to be, you know, it was an adult you know, network essentially. So that was the plan initially, but it ended up because of you know, streaming becoming like the thing now. It's like once Max or HBO Max became like the go-to for all those shows, that was like, you know, essentially where it was headed. So yeah, I think, you know, streaming can like make or break a show in that way, I think, you know. I mean, I think we had regular show. I'm grateful for the time that it came out because, you know, that was still in the pre-streaming days and it was like, you know, episodic and it was like coming out, you know, a new episode was coming out every week. And, you know, we had like advertising to help like get it going. And I think like there are some shows, like some animated shows that are coming out, and I think they want to like try and like keep people's interest going. And I think having it where it's like an episode coming out weekly as opposed to like all at once, you know, that's always like a good way to like keep, you know, the audience's interest peaked, I guess. I don't know. That makes sense. Yeah.
One thing I found was people didn't tend to talk about Close Enough quite as much. Like when it first came out, everybody was talking about it, but then time went on and um, people weren't really remembering it as much. And I noticed there were some cases where, like when the second and third seasons came out, loads of people online didn't even know that they'd come out. Despite that, I'm glad to see that there is going to be more regular show coming up.
Yeah, it's exciting. I think
It's cool because I mean, it's hard to believe how much time has passed since, you know, since the original regular show series, you know, had aired and had ended, and like I it's time is so weird, especially just in the last couple of years. But to look back even since then, like so much has happened, and like I think it's interesting to see how the show like throughout time has like affected different audiences and like, you know, throughout the, you know, years and as people have gotten older. I mean, like for instance, like you said before, like how you were like, you know, probably like in grade school when the show first came out when you saw it, and now you're in your 20s, and like it's just interesting to see like that actually blows my mind because I was in my 20s when I had started working on the series, and like now I'm almost 40, and like looking back, it's like, oh my God, like seeing over the years how it's affected people and like how like the humor and like just the style and like just the themes and like how the show, like how it's like, because you think when you're working on it at the time, like, oh, maybe it's only going to be like relevant to people from back then, but like it's still thankfully stood the test of time, and people can like thankfully like pop in whenever they want and like catch a random episode or, you know, binge the seasons or whatever. And like it's cool. I mean, you never, again, it was one of those things when I was working on it, I didn't know where it was going to go and like I didn't know how long it was going to go for. And I was just happy to have job security, but like to see how long it lasted and to see how like, you know, shows like Close Enough and other shows that have like kind of like taken after a regular show, like, you know, how it's kind of influenced a lot of other things. And I'm happy, you know, it's cool to see, you know, people are still into it and that's, you know, being revived, you know, it's cool to see that like people are into it. It's coming back and it's and people still have there's still like a love and like, not just nostalgia, but like a current love for it, even for people who just discover it for the first time, you know, like even for people who haven't grown up with it, like some did, you know, it's cool to see like it has an effect. So it's cool. Like I mean, like some shows are very like much a product of their time, like or the time when they came out, you know, and some shows maybe may not hold up as well because of when they came out or because like they were like promoting something that was, you know, popular at the time, like a product or whatever. But like it's cool. Like I'm glad it's not like dated necessarily. It's not like doesn't feel dated. It still feels like it could be watched today, which is nice. So you know, it's hard, you know, for some animated shows. You never know which shows are going to be more successful than others. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just glad, you know, I know Close Enough kind of like I think streaming kind of like hurt its popularity and maybe didn't help in terms of like advertising or whatever. And I don't know, but like I mean, the fact that regular show has such a following and made such an impact for, how long it lasted when it did, because it was one of the more longer, running shows I'd worked on, and I think like people really look at it and think, okay, what was it about that show that really like stood the test of time? And I think like just like the character and the simplicity behind like the plot, and like a lot of the themes, like we try to keep it as like basic, it was complex but basic at the same time, if that makes sense. Like I think it just had such a very unique and specific formula for what we did, like for an 11-minute episode. Like I think it really like definitely set the bar for its own thing. And, I think it shows like, the characters, like even throughout time, the characters can be memorable. You look at like a show like Scooby-Doo and it's like, how many different versions of that do we see, like, and I mean, again, it goes back to like that basic lineup of characters and like, you don't think about it when you see them. It's just like, oh, it's a bunch of kids and a talking dog, but like you get to know them and you know who they are throughout time. And you feel the same. I came to feel that way with regular show, like with, writing and getting into the psyches of all these characters, like Mordecai and Rigby. Mordecai and Rigby were easy because like it was like I tried to treat it like I was like treating it like, writing me and my friends from college or like people I knew growing up. And then like, getting into scenarios with like the boss and like, figuring out like, okay, like what are some work related scenarios from back before my animation days, like, old jobs that we had. Cause like regular show is very like of its time because I feel like it came out at a time when particularly like, I'm a millennial, so I feel like millennials at the time found something that was relatable, and at least like early Gen Z, because like it was very much like playing into like the times of like people trying to find work because it was like post recession. So it was a show about like cartoon characters, like trying to find minimum wage jobs, which is like such a specific like adult thing, but also very relatable to like people nowadays, especially with like, the economy and everything. And I think like regular show is very much like its own commentary on those elements in the zeitgeist, so to speak. If that makes sense, like how like, people, how the youth, like how people my age or younger, like how they approach jobs or, growing up and just life things, So I think that's part of like why it has such a very like timeless feel and very like good, like relevant feeling to it, I think. I don't know. This like kind of like timely resonance.
So, as we've mentioned, you did over 60 episodes of regular show. Out of everything that you've done on the show, which episode would you say that you were the most proud of?
I'll be honest, like every episode, like again, like I said before, every episode had its own like set of challenges and like, also each episode was rewarding in its own way. Like I'm very happy with like a lot of the specials that I had done. Two of which, like the White Elephant gift exchange and also the Thanksgiving episode. The Thanksgiving episode was a very like plot heavy, very involved episode, all the songs and everything and all the different like thing, the different action, all the action that happened. Like I'm very proud of a lot of those episodes, particularly, but I think even to this day, like I'll be honest, because I didn't know like how long I was gonna last on the show. I mean, again, even as you said it, like just now, like 60 episodes, I'm like, oh my God, was it really that many? It doesn't feel like that looking back on it, but like looking back, I'm like, and like actually looking at it, like, oh wow, I did do that many. Like it's kind of insane. Like because I got so used to it and it became like very much a part of me. And like I got to a point, especially towards like the latter seasons and the last one in particular, when, they all went to space and it was like very different and very zany. I think it was almost like being part of that journey and realizing, okay, it's getting a little out there. I kind of want to go back to feeling grounded again. I think that's when I realized I probably needed a creative change, having worked on regular show for so long. I liked it. I really enjoyed it, but I think that was around that time when I realized, it was time for like a change. So, but I remember working on the finale in particular, like that was actually like a big, like nice, kind of a bit of a surprise because I wasn't initially intending on working on it. Like I didn't know like how long for the last season I'd be working on up until at what point. And then like I did that episode you'd mentioned earlier, Meet the Seer. And I thought that'd be my last episode, but then I got offered to do, some work on the finale. And that was actually like a really nice and very special and highly, highly meaningful way for me to cap off my time on the show. And it was like kind of in a way, I didn't realize I was like wrapping everything up in like a nice, neat bow. Like my whole experience from even from dawn up until that point, like I didn't realize, oh wow, this is like the way I want to like end this. Like for the original series, this is how I want to end it. And I really remember thinking at the time, like, wow, I wasn't planning on it because I just was like so caught up in like working on like because when you're working on a show for a certain amount of time, you just kind of like get locked into like that pattern and like that kind of like mode. You're almost on autopilot, but like by the time I was like, oh wow, this is the finale, like this is it. Like I thought, okay, this is like something that needs to be like treated with care and it needs to be special. And like I really am very like I look back on that one and like a lot of people actually like still like look to that particular episode as like one of their favorites. And like it's kind of interesting because I've said it before, like when you as an artist are like kind of taking a step back and like looking objectively at everything you've done, at least for me, like it's always interesting to see how I started and how I ended. And like I think like the finale was like a really good way, like I said, to just like tie everything up all together. And like it really was like a good send off for me. And it was like almost like a send off of like all the episodes and all the specials of all the characters I'd done in the past. And like, it was all like one big special encapsulation of all that for the finale. So like, it was very nostalgic, but also like bittersweet because it was like I knew I was finishing up at that time and I really wanted to like give it my all and go out with a bang and just like, step away from a series that I felt really proud of. And I think the finale was the best way for me to like, to finish. So yeah.
Obviously, writing for over 60 episodes, you've written for a lot of characters as well. Which character would you say is your favorite to, well, I guess as a storyboard artist, both A, to draw and B, to write for?
I think by far my favorite character, both to write and draw for, was Muscle Man. Muscle Man was my favorite because he had like a very like you would think like just looking at him as a character and like the way he acted and the way he like would get all rowdy and go like twirl his shirt around like woo, like just seeing him like act like it was funny getting to like explore different sides of him as a character, like his more sentimental side, his more like personable side, his more like not just like his boisterous side, but which is also really fun to do. But like because that was like very pushed and like you could get like really like fun with like his acting and like the way you draw like his expressions and everything, but also like figuring out moments where you could like make him seem like really vulnerable as a character or more like human and like make him feel more relatable. So like I remember like having a lot of really funny moments with him. Him and Benson actually. Him and like because Muscle Man was a very like fun character to like make fun of and like get all crazy with, but also have like some rare moments of like of integrity and human qualities that you wouldn't expect from a cartoon character. But also Benson was another character that was like, okay, you could tell he was just like the bossy, character, the bossy character, like telling them what to do all the time. But it was fun. Like I remember the one episode I did where like it was the same episode Busted Cart where like I made that video game reference with the Fun Spot place. There was the scene where I did where like I had Benson, I wrote the dialogue where Benson was like having kind of a crash out moment with Mordecai and Rigby and melting down and telling them that his job was on the line. And I remember thinking, oh man, this is like a real like human moment I'm kind of like capturing. And I remember like thinking like, oh, this is like something you probably wouldn't see a lot in a cartoon, like just somebody talking about their job, like something that was adult, but kids, I think maybe, several years down the line, whoever was a kid when they saw that episode, they could like probably like start to see, oh yeah, now I know what Benson was going through. So yeah, I think those top were my top favorites for sure.
I'm one of those kids. So, what would you say are your main inspirations?
I have a lot of like different like artists who have influenced me over the years, particularly in animation, like I look back like for storyboarding in particular, like a big creative influence as far as like, how to approach storyboarding. Like when I went to college, I studied a lot from like the old, Disney features from back in the day, like Bill Pete. He was a big story artist from like the early Disney days, from like he did like 101 Dalmatians, Sword and Stone, like, he was a big influence as far as storyboarding. He was a big, he was a kind of a one of those old fashioned like iconic heroes I looked up to, but like as far as like more contemporary like artists, like there was a lot of like art from like, like Rocko's Modern Life, like Steven Hillenburg, like Joe Murray. One artist in particular who worked on SpongeBob, who was a big influence was Aaron Springer. He done like a lot of different like kind of like different pilots and like shows over the years. Like he worked on SpongeBob mainly, but he did like pilots that didn't really like make it through, unfortunately. He did a pilot called Korgoth of Barbaria for Adult Swim, which is really cool. It was very much like kind of like heavy metal inspired, like sword and sorcery kind of stuff. And like I really liked his sensibility. It was very like wacky and pushed and like it was very like cartoony. So like I really like looked up to him as far as like, creative influences at Cartoon Network and um, yeah, like so many different influences over the years, especially on different projects I've worked on. There's some like lately I've been getting into like some anime actually. Like am very much a big fan of like, old school like Japanese anime, like Akira, like stuff like that. I like some like Miyazaki stuff here and there, but yeah, a lot like it's very eclectic for sure.
Have you got any advice for people who want to become a storyboard artist or just work in the industry in general?
Well, the main thing, like in any animation related job, is to just honestly, no matter what part of the process that you're involved with, like you just have to draw and draw and draw, just like draw constantly. Like I think like not just drawing from like other animation artists or like shows or movies you like, which is fine. It's good to like study like what they did and what they did differently, and like it's good to see like why you like those shows or those movies. But mainly, honestly, if you can just take, experiences and like elements from your own life or just like go outside and like study from life in general, like just take from that, like really like find, because I think like part of why regular show did so well is because again, we try to find like very relatable elements, like, things that like we saw in our daily lives or like our upbringing or like people we knew. And we try to like kind of like instill aspects of those, parts of our lives, I think if you can like just simply go out and study like what makes people, act the way they act or like whoever like is like whoever they are, if you can study, like you're not like, I mean, you're essentially like stalking, but you're not really at the same time. You have to be kind of like secretive about it. You have to be careful, but like, like if you go out and like just bring a sketchbook with you and just like look around you and study like, different people around you or like, different locations even, like go to like a coffee shop or, a museum or somewhere, like just go anywhere, just go to an actual place that you wouldn't normally see yourself in and like, draw from that and draw like the people there and like really understand like what makes, a character unique, and I think like that's like the biggest element that makes an animated show or a movie is successful is just the character, like, and that's what I studied when I went to Cal Arts because character animation, focuses on like personality and story. And I think like that's part of like why regular show is so special and unique and successful is because it had a very specific and succinct like structure and specific characters. So I think if you can have like that as like your basic, those are the basic groundwork for your show or, an idea or whatever, like if it's a comic or a movie, whatever, like, I think that's like the most important thing is having character for sure.
Well, we're starting to head towards the end of the interview now. But before we go, I just want to ask, is there anything that maybe you've been working on recently or that's coming up that you want to promote?
Well, I did work on so I mentioned before I'm working more adult themed shows. Like I worked Mainly for Big Mouth, actually. I've worked back and forth between Big Mouth and the spin-off series, Human Resources. But the last season of the entire series, actually, the eighth and final season of Big Mouth dropped on Netflix late May. So I did some work on that recently that I'm pretty proud of. So yeah. Other than that, just kind of scoping out what's there right now. So we'll see.
And where can people find you on social media?
I tend to keep a rather low, a little bit of a lower profile when it comes to social media. My main source of social media that I always use, though, that I still use to this day, and you can find me on, is Instagram. My handle is just my name, essentially. It's just Benton, BentonConnor, Benton Connor. That's just my handle on Instagram. You can find me there. Yeah, I try not to like come up with a weird name. I wanted to keep it simple.
Right, well, that's great. Benton, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure too. Thanks so much.
Thank you once again to Benton Connor for joining us for this interview. Once again, make sure to follow Benton on Instagram at Benton Connor and check out the final season of Big Mouth, now available on Netflix. All links will be available in the description. Next time, we'll be speaking with Gabe Soria, a writer who penned Shakespeare in the Park, the only existing regular show novella to date. Here's a preview.
Regular Show is a raucous, goofy comedy, but it's very emotional. And at its core, it's a story about a group of friends who actually really like each other. And they get frustrated with each other, like we all do with our group of friends, but they all really like each other. Like Benson threatens to fire Mordecai and Rigby all the time, but they always have their job back because it's a sitcom. You have to keep that cycle going. They always stick up for each other. They always have each other's back. And they like hanging out with each other. Even when they annoy each other, they like hanging out. That show is about friendship and it's about love.